September 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. A Japanese ace wiped sweat from his brow as the engines warmed. Saburo Sakai, survivor of countless dogfights, watched ground crews roll fuel drums toward the waiting Zeros. The humid air shimmered over the steel runway. In his hand lay a fresh intelligence report. It spoke of a new American fighter, heavy as a bomber, slow, ungraceful. The F-6F Hellcat. He laughed. The Americans, he said to the younger pilots, build airplanes the way they build trucks. They laughed with him. The Zero had ruled the Pacific for nearly 2 years. Engines roared across the tarmac. Propellers carved the air into thunder. Mechanics ducked under the wings as Sakai climbed into his cockpit. The thin fuselage gleamed white in the sun. The aircraft weighed less than 2.5 tons. It could turn tighter than anything the Americans had. Every pilot on that field believed it was untouchable. At 0900, flight control reported a radar contact south of the island. The squadron leader smiled. Another American reconnaissance plane, probably the same type they had burned from the sky all summer. Within minutes, 6 Zeros were airborne, climbing through scattered clouds. Below, the jungle steamed. Above, the morning sky widened into blue infinity. The first enemy shape appeared at 20,000 feet. Broad wings, thick body, strange outline. The pilots radioed in confusion. It looked like a torpedo bomber, but it climbed too fast. The Hellcat's nose dipped, and tracer fire sliced the air. 2 Zeros fell before they could react. The survivors tried to turn inside it, but the American fighter stayed with them. Metal screamed. One by one, white trails spiraled into the sea. When Sakai returned to base that evening, the laughter was gone. Reports listed 4 aircraft destroyed, 3 pilots missing. Ground crews worked silently under lantern light, patching bullet holes. On the few that survived, no one spoke of the Hellcat, but every man who had seen it understood. Something had shifted. For the first time in the war, Japanese pilots faced an enemy that did not merely fight, it calculated. And calculation, they would soon learn, could kill faster than courage. In the first years of the Pacific War, Japan believed the heavens themselves favored the Zero. Its wings cut through the air like blades through silk. Its pilots fought with conviction born from conquest. China, the Philippines, the Indies. Everywhere they flew, enemies burned. The design was a statement of faith, speed through lightness, victory through spirit. Engineers at Mitsubishi had stripped the aircraft of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to gain agility. The trade saved hundreds of kilograms. In 1941, it seemed genius. At 20,000 feet, a Zero could outclimb and outturn any Western fighter. When the first squadron struck Pearl Harbor, the myth began. By the spring of 1942, that myth had become doctrine. Naval manuals described the Zero as an extension of the samurai code. Silent, precise, unstoppable. Training emphasized discipline over numbers. 1 pilot equaled 10 Americans. Reports from early battles confirmed the idea. Over the Philippines, 36 Zeros destroyed more than 100 American aircraft in 2 days. In the Java Sea, Japanese fighters slaughtered British and Dutch squadrons. Even at Coral Sea, where ships burned on both sides, the air duels favored Japan. But behind the victories, cracks had begun. American factories were learning faster than the Japanese realized. Data from Midway, altitude, speed, loss ratios, went into every drawing board at Grumman. The engineers did not dream, they calculated. The next aircraft would not be beautiful. It would be durable, standardized, efficient to build and repair. Its name would be Hellcat. The Zero had required artisan craftsmanship, rivets hand-fit, controls balanced by feel. Japan could build maybe 100 a month. The United States would build 400 Hellcats in the same time, then increase to 2,000 by the end of 1943. Production was no longer an industry. It was a weapon. The philosophy split the sky in two. Japan believed flight was an art of courage. America treated it as an equation of horsepower, armor, and training hours. By 1943, Japanese instructors noticed a new kind of American pilot. He fought without hesitation. His turns were shallow but deliberate. He climbed, rolled, and attacked as if following an invisible chart. He was not superior in instinct. He was following a system. On paper, the Hellcat seemed impossible. It weighed twice as much as the Zero. It carried thicker armor, heavier guns, and a more powerful engine. Yet its design obeyed one simple law: survive one hit, return with data, improve. The Americans had turned aerial combat into a feedback loop. Each mission produced numbers, and numbers refined machines. Meanwhile, Japan's schools still trained for duels of honor. Aerial victories were counted, but lessons were oral, scattered, unrecorded. When a veteran died, his experience died with him. By 1943, attrition was erasing wisdom faster than it could be replaced. Captain Tadashi Nakajima, a veteran of China, wrote in his diary, "We have forgotten that machines also learn." He meant that America's strength came not from pilots, but from process. The Japanese had entered an industrial war with medieval habits. That year, a single American carrier could launch more aircraft than Japan could build in a month. The ratio widened every week. On the deck of the USS Essex, flight officers timed takeoffs by stopwatch. Every 10 seconds another Hellcat left the deck. Every 30 seconds another landed. The choreography resembled assembly more than battle. In Tokyo, planners dismissed these statistics. They believed spirit would compensate for material inferiority. It had worked before against Russia in 1905. It had worked against China. But they were facing something different now, a society that had mechanized courage itself. The empire's faith in the sky rested on the assumption that man remained the center of war. The Americans had quietly moved the center to the machine. By late 1943, even victories began to feel hollow. Pilots returned with stories of American planes that refused to fall, of machine guns that never jammed, of radio coordination that guided squadrons with uncanny precision. Japan still held territory, but the air above it was shifting. In that moment between triumph and doubt, the empire's confidence burned brightest. It was the calm, before logic, a faith untested by the numbers that were already being written in factories across the ocean. Autumn 1943. The Central Pacific shimmered under relentless sunlight. On Wake Island, coral dust clung to boots and instruments alike. The war had reached a turning point few yet recognized. The Zero still flew, but the new American fighter, the F-6F Hellcat, had begun to rewrite the sky's geometry. The first confirmed engagements came in September and October. Japanese patrols from Rabaul reported strange aircraft that did not behave as expected. In one encounter near Marcus Island, 6 Zeros met what they believed were outdated Wildcats. The lead pilot dived to attack, expecting his lighter aircraft to gain the advantage. Instead, the American plane climbed through his turn, reversed position, and fired from above. 2 Zeros disintegrated before the others understood. The survivors returned with sketches of thick wings and a squared tail, a silhouette they had never seen. The Americans called these first missions shakedowns. Each sortie generated precise data: ammunition expenditure, climb rate, damage reports, radio coordination efficiency. The pilots were not improvising. They were testing algorithms born from ground analysis. By the 10th engagement, U.S. Navy statisticians already knew the Hellcat's kill ratio exceeded 5-1. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhorter, flying off USS Yorktown, later recalled, "It wasn't flying, it was statistics in motion." Every bullet was logged, every maneuver timed. The fighter itself was a node in a vast feedback network linking pilots, engineers, and factories back in New York. Japanese commanders dismissed early losses as anomalies. The Imperial Navy still claimed more than 2,000 operational aircraft across its island chain. But the quality of pilots had declined sharply. Veterans from China and Midway were gone, replaced by recruits with only half the flight hours once required for combat readiness. In contrast, American naval aviators now graduated with over 300 hours of flight and simulator training, triple the Japanese average. At Rabaul, maintenance crews worked by hand, filing engine valves and reusing spark plugs. Spare parts came through submarine runs that could not keep pace. For every Zero assembled, America delivered 40 Hellcats to the fleet. Logistics had become the new battlefield. By November, air combat reports from Wake, Tarawa, and the Gilberts revealed a pattern. The Zero could still outturn the Hellcat in tight circles. But the American pilots avoided those duels. They climbed into vertical space, where horsepower ruled. The Zero's fragile engine struggled above 25,000 feet. The Hellcat thrived there. When the Japanese tried to follow, their engines overheated and failed. Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare summarized the new doctrine: don't dogfight, dictate. It was the birth of energy fighting. As procedure, not art. On December 4, 1943, radar aboard USS Bunker Hill detected a Japanese strike formation approaching from 120 miles. 24 Hellcats scrambled in under 3 minutes. The radar vectoring system guided them directly onto the enemy's path. The result was surgical. Within 15 minutes, 21 Japanese bombers and fighters were destroyed. The Americans lost 1 aircraft, recovered by rescue destroyer. From that day, Japanese intercepts of American communications began referring to machines that see. They meant radar. In the Pacific, technology had become an intelligence organ as alive as any pilot. The psychological effect was corrosive. Surviving Japanese aviators wrote in their diaries of invisible eyes and iron hunters that never tire. One entry from a downed pilot recovered after the battle read simply, "We met them in the sun. The sun belonged to them." Each skirmish widened the gulf between belief and outcome. The Empire's faith had promised victory through willpower. The sky answered with probability. By the end of 1943, the kill ratio had climbed to nearly 10-1 in the Hellcat's favor. American analysts plotted the data on charts that looked like descending staircases, each step a shattered Japanese squadron. Commanders called it efficiency. The pilots called it inevitability. Japan still controlled thousands of miles of ocean, but the air above those waters was now measured, graphed, and predicted. The Empire had entered a war of equations without realizing it. In that realization, faint but growing, lay the first tremor of collapse. In early 1944, the Pacific War became a laboratory. Every sortie, every crash, every round fired fed into a growing database that no one yet called by that name. The Americans had discovered how to make war learn. At the Grumman plant on Long Island, engineers studied reports from squadrons deployed across the Pacific. Bullet entry angles, fuel line fractures, gun camera film, all dissected and cross-checked within hours of arrival. What once took months in wartime correspondence now took days. The feedback moved faster than the enemy could adapt. Each Hellcat that returned carried the memory of combat not just for its pilot, but for the entire system. Japan had no such channel. Reports from Rabaul or Truck arrived weeks late, often filtered through layers of censorship. Failures were omitted, errors softened. Commanders feared shame more than inefficiency. And shame, like corrosion, spread quietly. Through the Empire's war machine, radar stations aboard carriers multiplied. The CXAM and later SK sets extended detection to 100 miles. Every blip on a phosphor screen became a vector. Every vector a prediction. Controllers on the USS Enterprise guided interceptors with calm precision. Angels 15, bearing 090. Pilots obeyed without seeing the target. For the first time, human eyes were no longer the instrument of awareness. The machine had learned to sense. Japanese doctrine still prized intuition. Pilots were taught to read clouds and wind, to feel the enemy's presence. But instinct could not outpace electrons. When the Americans fused radar with mathematics, air combat ceased to be chance. It became choreography. Training changed. Accordingly, at Jacksonville and Pensacola, new simulators reproduced combat scenarios using film projection and radio cues. Recruits drilled until reaction merged with reflex. Instructors measured success not by inspiration but by replication. If one pilot survived an encounter, others would repeat his sequence exactly. By mid-1944, this system produced an outcome few could comprehend. Uniform excellence. No more lone aces defining battles. Instead, Every pilot became a replaceable node, part of an evolving network. Machines learned through men, and men through machines. Japanese analysts noticed. Intelligence from captured documents described American flight patterns as identical, mechanical, unnaturally calm. They mistook uniformity for weakness. In truth, it was the opposite. Every Hellcat squadron functioned like synchronized machinery. Captain David McCampbell, later America's top naval ace, described it simply. You didn't fight alone. You fought as an equation. In the system's shadow, the Zero aged quickly. Its designers at Mitsubishi had foreseen none of this. They built for duels, not data. They built for instinct, not integration. Attempts to modernize the A6M5 model with thicker skin and improved speed came too late. Against the Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney engine, no refinement could bridge the gap. Factories in Japan struggled even to deliver spare propellers. Allied submarines had severed shipping lines to aluminum sources. The once sleek aircraft now rolled off production lines with wooden components. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy introduced self-sealing fuel tanks, automatic mixture controls, and standardized cockpit layouts across all models. A pilot trained on one carrier could transfer to another without hesitation. Every improvement fed into the next iteration. The Americans had created what Japanese officers later called the circle of steel. It meant the machine learned, improved, and multiplied faster than destruction could erase it. The feedback reached the battlefield most visibly in communication. Each flight leader reported position, altitude, and enemy numbers over coded radio. The carrier's Combat Information Center plotted these in real time. On wall boards glowed symbols representing men still fighting beyond the horizon. The battle itself had become a flow of data. Japan could not follow. Most Zero units still relied on visual signals, colored flares, hand gestures, and voice shouts muffled by engine noise. Coordination collapsed under chaos. Individual bravery turned into isolated death. One Japanese pilot captured at Kwajalein told his interrogators, "Their planes talked to each other. Ours prayed." By the time spring reached the Pacific, the difference was absolute. The Americans had built a distributed mind in the sky. The next phase would test its limits. In the summer of 1944, that system faced the greatest armada Japan had ever launched. The Marianas awaited, and with them, the final proof that machines now ruled the air. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. At dawn, the horizon was a wall of steel. 15 American carriers steamed east of Saipan, their decks crowded with Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntless bombers. Beneath them, destroyers carved perfect white. Wakes through cobalt water. Every formation held its position within meters. To the west, more than 400 Japanese aircraft prepared to attack. The largest air battle in history was about to begin. Radar picked them up first. At 100 miles, controllers aboard USS Lexington saw the wave approaching. The message passed through the Combat Information Center like an electric pulse. Pilots sprinted from ready rooms. Engines coughed, then roared. Within 6 minutes, 200 Hellcats were airborne, a response that once would have taken hours. The Japanese formation climbed to meet them. Pilots believed they were striking a wounded fleet. Imperial Command had promised that surprise would offset their disadvantage. They flew with faith, not facts. No radar guided them. No electronic navigation corrected their drift. The Pacific below was featureless blue, and errors multiplied with every mile. At 10:36 a.m., the first contact occurred 70 miles from the fleet. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell led a section of Hellcats into the enemy's path. Sunlight glinted off canopies as the two forces closed at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. The Americans struck first. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber guns ripped through the fragile aluminum of Japanese bombers. Entire formations disintegrated before reaching their targets. Below, gunners aboard USS South Dakota watched with disbelief as burning aircraft plunged into the sea. One sailor described it later. It was like clay pigeons in sunlight. They never even got close. Wave after wave followed. The outcome never changed. American fighters operated through radar vectors, ground control, and practiced discipline. Japanese squadrons attacked in confusion, scattered by interception before reaching bomb range. By midday, over 200 Japanese planes had been destroyed. The fleet suffered minimal damage, a single bomb strike on a transport, extinguished within minutes. From the deck cameras of USS Enterprise, gun footage later reviewed by analysts showed a surreal pattern. Zeros diving into crossfire, torpedo planes burning before, releasing payloads, pilots bailing into smoke. The calm voices on American radios contrasted with the chaos visible below. At 1 p.m., Admiral Ozawa launched his final reserve, 150 aircraft from carriers Zuikaku and Hyo. Only 30 reached visual contact with the American fleet. None returned. By evening, the sea was dotted with burning oil slicks stretching for miles. McCampbell, landing after 7 victories that day, told his ground crew, "They never touched us." He would end the war with 34 kills, yet the battle was less about aces and more about systems. Every radar pulse, every maintenance check, every logistic schedule had converged into this moment of near-perfect efficiency. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For the Japanese, it was the death of the air fleet. More than 400 aircraft destroyed in one day. 29 American planes lost, most to accidents or fuel exhaustion. The kill ratio exceeded 14-1. Inside Japan's naval headquarters, silence followed the reports. Admiral Toyota refused to believe them until reconnaissance photographs confirmed empty carrier decks. Veteran pilots gone, training cadres erased. The Empire's air arm had collapsed in a single afternoon. Night fell over the Philippine Sea. Flames flickered on the water, each one a drifting memorial. The survivors clung to rafts, listening to distant engines of the American fleet moving onward, untouched. Above them, searchlights swept methodically, not in triumph, but in procedure, part of a process that no longer needed emotion to function. 4 Japanese aviators who lived through the battle, the realization came slowly. They had not been defeated by bravery or superior skill. They had been erased by organization. A captured pilot, exhausted and burned, whispered to his interrogator days later, "Our courage met their mathematics." That equation would define the rest of the war. In the aftermath of the Philippine Sea, the Empire of Japan faced a silence it could not explain. The numbers were unthinkable: 470 aircraft lost, hundreds of pilots dead, and almost no damage inflicted on the American fleet. Yet what shook Japan was not only the loss itself, it was the impossibility of understanding how it had happened. For years, the Zero had been more than a machine. It was a symbol of national destiny. To question it was to question the soul of the empire. But after the Marianas, even faith began to fracture. Reports from the surviving carriers reached Tokyo days later. They were lists, units erased, names missing, fuel spent. Nothing heroic, only arithmetic. In the officers' mess at Yokosuka, the veterans drank in silence. Commanders avoided eye contact. They knew the truth, but lacked the language to say it. The old code, Yamato Damashii, the spirit of Japan, had met something it could not defeat. Not firepower alone, but process. Factories across the home islands tried to recover. The Nakajima and Mitsubishi plants resumed night shifts, producing replacements that no longer mattered. Without trained pilots, the new planes were ghosts. Training schools shortened courses from 9 months to 4. Students took off once, landed once, and were declared ready. By autumn 1944, Japan was sending boys into combat after 40 hours of flight. America's pilots averaged 300. The imbalance reached absurdity. U.S. carriers replaced lost aircraft within days. Japan waited months for replacements. That never arrived. Fuel shipments dwindled. Maintenance crews stripped wrecks for parts. By the end of the year, the empire was flying on fragments. Amid this collapse, letters from the front painted a new emotion: disbelief. Lieutenant Noboru Tanaka, a surviving pilot from the Hyo, wrote home, "We fought like wind, but the wind no longer moves mountains." His words were censored. Yet copies circulated among air cadets as warnings. Admiral Ozawa submitted his report to Imperial headquarters with a single line underlined twice. "We have lost control of the air." The psychological weight was crushing. For a generation raised on the certainty of victory, defeat was untranslatable. In barracks, instructors replaced lectures on tactics with lessons on self-sacrifice. If technology could not be matched, then faith would fill the gap. The seeds of the kamikaze were planted not in fanaticism, but in despair. Meanwhile, the Americans grew colder. Faster, more precise. Production shifted into a rhythm approaching automation. Each carrier held repair crews capable of rebuilding damaged aircraft within hours. New radar systems distinguished friend from foe automatically. Refueling, rearming, and relaunching became a mechanical cycle measured in minutes. The human element still existed, but it now served the system, not the other way around. On Saipan, Marines found crashed Japanese planes stripped of instruments, their pilots dead inside. Intelligence officers noticed something haunting. Many cockpits contained notebooks filled with personal poems or family photographs taped beside compasses. Technology and emotion shared the same confined space, and only one survived. By late 1944, American strategists no longer spoke of air superiority. They spoke of air ownership. The sky was no longer contested, it was administered. Hellcats patrolled like clockwork, maintaining constant coverage from dawn to nightfall. For Japanese ships or convoys, daylight itself became lethal. In Tokyo, engineers debated impossible solutions: jet propulsion, heavier armor, miracle designs. But Japan lacked the aluminum, fuel, and time to test them. Reality had reduced invention to fantasy. The collapse of belief reached its human limit on October 25th, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. As American fleets advanced, Admiral Onishi approved the first organized kamikaze units. The logic was brutally simple. If machines could not win, men would become weapons. Each pilot received a ceremonial cup of sake, then launched an aircraft stripped of armor and returned fuel. It was faith distilled to its last function, destruction. Yet even these sacrifices could not alter the equations. Radar tracked them. Gunfire computed their angles. When their planes hit, the ships survived and returned to formation. The Empire's final weapon met the same enemy that had already conquered its sky: precision. In the diaries of captured officers, the tone shifted from pride to analysis. "They fight without hatred," one wrote. "Their power is not emotion. It is measurement." The myth had died. The system remained. Winter 1944. The war had turned into a contest of endurance, not courage. The Imperial Navy still flew, but the air belonged to those who could refuel, reload, and replace faster. Then destruction could consume them. For every Japanese sortie that rose into the fading sky, 10 Hellcats waited. The machine had learned to outlast man. At Ulithi Atoll, the American fleet operated like a breathing organism. Tankers delivered fuel on schedule measured to the hour. Supply ships arrived with precision ground parts, propellers, and ammunition packaged by specification. Maintenance crews could replace an engine overnight and test fly it by dawn. Pilots rotated between missions and rest cycles calculated to maintain reaction time. Each action supported the next in seamless rhythm. Lieutenant John Strain of the USS Essex described the process in his log. "It felt less like a battle and more like a shift change at a factory. Everyone knew what to do, and nothing depended on luck." Japan's pilots saw the same rhythm from the other side and called it unnatural. To them, war was supposed to be human, unpredictable, a contest of spirit. What they faced instead was pattern, relentless, mathematical, immune to emotion. By early 1945, Japan's fuel reserves had fallen below crisis level. Each training sortie consumed precious aviation gasoline that could never be replaced. Instructors cut engines midair to glide, saving drops. Crews pushed planes by hand to conserve fuel for takeoff. The empire that had once built its faith on mastery of flight now counted every liter like blood. Meanwhile, Hellcats left their carriers in disciplined lines, each flight following radar-guided paths that covered the ocean in interlocking Arcs. The sky became grid work. The old duelist's art of aerial combat had been replaced by geometry. Inside the combat information centers, officers studied glowing screens as calm voices relayed. Bearings. Vector 210, Angels 20. They spoke like mathematicians. Their emotion was precision. For the men who flew beneath that system, the transformation was both empowering and alienating. Pilots no longer felt like individuals defining history but components in a design larger than themselves. The shift marked the dawn of modern warfare, the replacement of personal heroism with systemic function. Across the Pacific, the Japanese tried to replicate this rhythm and failed. Their communications were broken by lack of parts and training. Radar remained primitive. The chain of information from observation to response stretched too far. A warning that took 1 minute for an American carrier to process took Japan 15. In that gap, lives vanished. Captured diaries from the Yokosuka Air Group revealed frustration, not rage. One pilot wrote, "We see them first, but they strike first. The machine moves before thought." It was an acknowledgement of a truth that Japanese culture had long resisted. Mastery without structure is fragile. The Americans, by contrast, had learned to turn skill into system. Training schools standardized every movement, from takeoff to gun burst. Instructors used film from gun cameras to analyze hits frame by frame. Mistakes became data, not disgrace. Pilots who erred survived to improve. Japanese pilots who failed died and took their lessons with them. This asymmetry produced more than victory. It produced predictability. Every engagement became another proof of concept. Kill ratios of 10-1 grew into 15-1. Battles no longer surprised, they confirmed. By February 1945, when the first B-29 raids reached Tokyo, few Japanese pilots believed they could stop them. They flew anyway. Honor demanded presence, even if victory was impossible. One captain wrote before his final mission, "We fly into certainty, not chance." What began as pride had evolved into fatalism. The system that once promised perfection of spirit now demanded sacrifice for its own sake. On the other side, the Americans faced their own paradox. They had built a machine of victory but stripped it of glory. In briefings, commanders forbade talk of revenge or heroism. Objectives were stated as coordinates and timelines. When planes returned, crews logged performance. Metrics before writing to families. Emotion became paperwork. Yet amid the machinery, individual conscience still flickered. McCampbell, reviewing gun camera film, paused on a frame showing a 0. Breaking apart. "You could see the pilot's head," he said later. "He wasn't my enemy anymore. Just a man inside an equation." By the time the war reached Okinawa, the equation was complete. Systems of radar, logistics, and training had merged into a single continuous machine. Global, automatic, almost self-sustaining. Human error had been reduced to a manageable variable. For Japan, the realization came too late. Its warriors still carried the memory of mastery, but mastery without support was extinction. In the end, skill had not vanished. It had been absorbed into blueprints, checklists, and operating manuals. The individual had not failed. The system had evolved beyond him. March 1945. Tokyo burned. From a rooftop near the Sumida River, engineer Masao Tsuruda watched the night dissolve in fire. The air raid sirens had stopped hours ago. What remained was wind, carrying sparks, ash, and paper that once held the blueprints of his aircraft designs. Below, neighborhoods vanished block by block beneath the glow of 10,000 American incendiaries. The noise had no rhythm, only endurance. Tsuruda had spent a decade designing fighters. He knew every rivet of a Zero's frame. He had believed that lightness was purity, that to win, Japan must strip away excess, even armor, until the plane itself became an extension of the pilots. Now, as B-29 bombers drew wide arcs above the city, he understood how completely that faith had failed. Each bomber weighed over 60 tons and carried more fire than his entire workshop could have imagined. They flew guided by radar beams from ships hundreds of miles away. They navigated by instruments, not instinct. Their crews never even saw the city they destroyed. It was no longer combat. It was process. The sky above Tokyo had become an assembly line of destruction. At 0200 hours, Air Defense Command transmitted its last coherent message of the night. Communications broke. Under heat and static. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly. In control rooms, officers stared at needles that no longer moved. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Machines now executed decisions that once required generals. To the Americans, it was efficiency. To the Japanese who watched from the ground, it was revelation. In the bunkers of the Imperial General Staff, officers studied the reports in disbelief. Entire districts had vanished within 3 hours. Yet American losses were negligible, a handful of planes out of hundreds. The numbers were so one-sided that even the bureaucrats stopped editing them. War had become arithmetic, and the equation had only one answer. Colonel Hayashi, a surviving staff officer, later wrote, "We were not fighting men anymore. We were fighting their production schedules." As dawn broke, smoke turned the sky the color of graphite. Survivors searched for water and found only boiling puddles. In one street, Tsuruta saw a melted propeller blade protruding from the rubble, his creation reduced to symbol. He whispered, "The machines have learned to kill without us." Elsewhere, American pilots returning to Guam filled their logs with coordinates and altitudes. Not a word about fear or mercy. Their mission reports read like inventory lists. Yet within their quiet routine lay something monumental, the complete mechanization of air war. The Hellcat, born from lessons of 1943, had paved the way. It proved that victory came from system integration, not valor. The B-29 perfected it. Altitude replaced dueling. Circuits replaced instinct. Humanity had been moved to the margins of the machine's logic. For Japan's remaining fighter groups, the realization came in fragments. They scrambled against bombers they could not reach. Their engines failed at the edge of altitude. Their bullets vanished into the night. Each sortie ended the same way, a trace of vapor curling into sky already owned by others. By April, the Empire's skies were no longer a battlefield. They were a domain. The Americans owned the daylight through range and sensors. The night belonged to radar. When Japanese pilots rose, they did so into mapped air, already measured and claimed. In letters recovered after the war, a lieutenant from the 343rd Air Group wrote, "We rise like ghosts. The enemy does not see us because he already knows where we are." That line captured the end of an era. The warrior's horizon had closed. From now on, machines would dictate the rhythm of life and death. In the ashes of Tokyo, engineers who once built fighters began designing looms, turbines, and electric motors. They no longer spoke of glory, only precision. In that silence began the foundation of post-war Japan, a nation rebuilt on the same discipline that once powered its defeat. The sky no longer asked for courage. It asked for design. August 1945. Japan ceased to fight. The empire's surrender was announced not by trumpet or ceremony, but by radio static. Across ruined cities, people gathered around speakers to hear the emperor's voice, distant, hesitant, filtered through crackling transmission. The words were formal, but the meaning was final. The war was over. In airfields from Kyushu to Hokkaido, pilots stood beside planes that would never take off again. Some touched the metal skins as if saying farewell to comrades. Others simply turned away. The hangars smelled of oil and dust. Silence, not smoke, filled the sky. For the aviators who had survived the years of burning clouds, defeat was not a single moment, but a long erosion of belief. Letters from disbanded units spoke the same tone, exhaustion mixed with awe. Lieutenant Kazuo Nakajima wrote, "They fought with calculation. We fought with faith." The numbers did not care. At Yokosuka, inspectors from the Allied occupation forces cataloged the remains of Japan's air power. Rows of zeros lined the runways, their paint scorched by sun and time. The once legendary machines looked fragile now, almost skeletal. Technicians measured them for study, noting design elegance, but also fatal omissions. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, no redundancy. Courage had replaced engineering, and courage had failed. In the archives, captured documents told a parallel story: flight logs, production tables, endless lists of lost squadrons. Every figure confirmed what the war had already decided: the system had won. Machines had multiplied beyond imagination, and process had consumed passion. Yet amid defeat, reflection began. Some former officers turned their thoughts inward. Admiral Agaki wrote before his final mission, "We mistook beauty for strength." He took off in a kamikaze plane, hours after the Emperor's broadcast, and never returned. Others survived and recorded the reckoning. Engineer Masao Tsuruda, now employed dismantling aircraft for scrap, kept a single instrument dial from a Hellcat recovered at Yokosuka. "It represents what we lacked," he wrote. "Precision that forgets pride." The Allied reports from 1946 confirmed the scale of imbalance. For every Japanese aircraft built in the last year of the war, America built 12. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained 20. The empire had lost not in bravery, but in iteration. The silence that followed was deeper than defeat. It was recognition. Streets once filled with banners of conquest now echoed with hammering from reconstruction crews. Factories that once forged engines now repaired bicycles. And radios. The same hands that had built weapons turned to rebuild civilization. In classrooms, children learned new lessons, not of honor, but of efficiency, measurement, and design. War had taught Japan that emotion without structure leads to ruin. Peace would teach it how structure without emotion could build again. In 1948, a group of former aircraft engineers founded a small firm in Hamamatsu to manufacture sewing machines. Their precision came from the same discipline that once shaped fighter planes. Within decades, those machines would power a new kind of empire. Industrial, quiet, relentless. The legacy of defeat became the foundation of mastery. For the men who had once flown the Zero, memory became their only sky. Veteran meetings were few. Many avoided speaking of the war at all. When they did, they used the same phrase, Shizuka na Sora, the silent sky. It meant both peace and emptiness. In a rare interview, an elderly pilot summarized the lesson with calm detachment. "We flew as men. They fought as a system. The system remembered everything. History would remember too. Not the duels, not the banners, but the moment." Humanity discovered its limit in the mirror of its own creation. In the quiet after the storm, Japan began to rebuild itself under the same truth that had destroyed its empire. Precision was power. The silence over the empire was not absence. It was awakening. By the end of the war, the question of who owned the sky no longer needed an answer. The sky itself had changed. It no longer belonged to courage or instinct. It belonged to process, to the logic of engines, data, and repetition. In the ruins of the 1940s, nations redefined strength. Japan rebuilt not through spirit, but through structure. Engineers who once drew fighter wings now drew transistor circuits. The principles were identical: precision, balance, endurance. The same discipline that once forged machines of death now built machines of life. The Americans, too, carried the lesson forward. The Hellcat's descendants became jets, guided missiles, and computers. Each generation of weapon grew less human, more systemic. What began as radar plots and flight logs evolved into networks and automation. The pilot who once fought by instinct was now one part of an algorithmic chain, a human node inside a vast machine. The Second World War had not ended the duel between man and system. It had decided it. From the Marianas to Tokyo, every battle proved the same equation: belief without data fails. Courage without coordination dies, and skill without structure fades. In post-war decades, historians called the transformation technological. It was more than that. It was philosophical. Humanity had discovered that mastery was no longer measured by strength or will but by design, by how quickly knowledge could turn into method. On museum floors today, the Zero and the Hellcat stand side by side. One represents purity of spirit, the other precision of system. Both are silent now, yet the silence speaks. The world that followed was built from their contrast. In the quiet reflection of veterans and engineers alike, the truth endures. The machine did not destroy the warrior. It absorbed him. The sky no longer tests courage. It measures design.